So I did a check on the church website a couple of days ago, and I thought, how long is it that we've been going through Mark? And we started it, as far as I could see, in October 2023, the three of us, Mike, Rob and I, and it's now 2025 and we still haven't finished it. And I thought Rob was going to do it tonight, but he's not. But I'm guessing that Rob will probably doing this sometime in February, possibly. So we'll have finished Mark in February 2025. And you think, for a short book, there's lots in there, isn't it? And that's why it's kept us going all this time. And we could have spent longer and longer than we have done on Mark, because it's just, even though it's compact, there's so much in it. And that's, I hope, what we'll find this morning. Rob's going to finish it off, obviously, in a few weeks. I don't know whether he feels he's drawn the short straw with the last passage, but I feel, although he's very willing to do it, but I feel that I've been passed the long straw, because I've got the resurrection, the most wonderful event in human history, isn't it? I know that we talk about the death of Jesus and what he accomplished, and that is wonderful. But this is exciting because God raised him from the dead. And I was thinking this little passage, it's got historical and doctrinal and personal devotional things for us this morning, things for me to draw upon. And that's what I found when I was sort of researching and thinking about this passage. And of course, as we all know, there are 4 gospel accounts of the resurrection, and each one is quite different. Matthew tells us about the guards and the earthquake. Luke tells us about Peter's experience and that Jesus had appeared separately to him and also to Cleopas and another disciple as they were walking on the road to Emmaus. We don't get that here. And John tells us about Peter and John running to the tomb and John getting there first. John wanted to tell us that he was the faster runner, but these details are not in all the Gospels. They're all different. And of course, we get the bit where Thomas doubts as well in John's Gospel. But this morning, I'll mainly be looking at Mark with just the occasional passing reference to the other Gospel accounts this morning, because in Mark, there's plenty to ponder on, plenty for us. I will, of course, go to the text in a moment, but I want to bookend this message this morning by looking at a couple of things, or 3 things actually, that Paul said about the resurrection. So before we look at the text, I just want to read something out or mention something that he or summarize something that Paul said to the Corinthian church in chapter 15. Paul was concerned that some people didn't believe that the dead were raised. And he says that if Christ isn't raised from the dead, the following things apply. He said, firstly, preaching is useless if Christ isn't raised from the dead. And so is our faith. It's a waste of time. He says, and more than that, Paul and anyone preaching Christ is lying about God. And Christians are still in their sins. And he says, if the dead are not raised, we are, of all people, to be most pitied. So these things that we believe are really important, whether this is true or not, is really important. And in verse 30, he just finishes. He says, and as for us, why do we endanger ourselves every hour? I face death every day. Yes, surely as I boast about you in Christ Jesus our Lord. If I fought wild beasts in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. In other words, if Christ isn't raised from the dead and there's no resurrection, there's nothing to hope for. We're wasting our time here meeting together. There's no point in it. There's no point in following Christ. Let's not bother. Let's just enjoy ourselves. If Christ is not raised, then we're wasting our time. But he is raised from the dead, and we're not. And in fact, as Paul told them a few verses earlier, he's convinced that Jesus is raised from the dead. not just because he's had a vision of the risen Christ or he's met the risen Christ, but because after Jesus' resurrection, he was seen in the flesh by absolutely tons of people. Loads of people met Jesus in the flesh. And Paul met and knew these people. You know, he talked to people. He talked to Peter and the other apostles. He talked to loads and loads of disciples. And they'd met Jesus, the risen Jesus. So there was no doubt in Paul's mind, and there shouldn't be any doubt in our mind, that Jesus is raised from the dead and that we're not wasting our time coming here every week to meet together and praying and things like that. So let's have a look at what Mark has to say about the resurrection. In verse 1 and 2, it's interesting that we see the three women who were on their way to the tomb and were given their names: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, or Salome. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. I think people have always pronounced it Salome. Is that right? And Mark has told us their names twice already in the previous passages, which is interesting. He keeps repeating their names. And I was thinking, in the last 30 years or so, there's been a lot of work by serious scholars. I'll mention one. Richard Bauckham has done a lot of work on the fact that the reason why we have the Gospels is because there were eyewitness testimonies. There were real people who saw these things, and these passages have all the marks of, eyewitnesses, people who were real and told their stories. And serious scholars have done a lot of work on this, showing that the Gospels are based on these testimonies. And the writers have got their stories, the narratives, from real living people who told them and passed them on. And that's why we see their names here, the two Marys and Salome. They'd no doubt have sat around telling these stories, for years afterwards, to Mark and Luke and other people, and countless and hundreds of times. And people would have heard these stories firsthand from people who were really there at the scene that morning. And I'll return to that a little later. But it does seem to be the case, doesn't it, that although they had, these two Marys and Salome had this lovely devotion to Jesus, they loved him and wanted to anoint his body with spices, there's a definite sense in which they were lacking in faith that morning when they went to the tomb. What were they expecting to see? They were expecting to see a dead and rotting body, because they were taking the spices to take away the horrible smell that starts to come from a body that's rotting. That's why they were going to anoint his body. But the fact is that Jesus had predicted what was going to happen. He predicted these events. Even in Mark, the briefest of the Gospels, we find him predicting all these things that were going to happen 3 times. And in fact, 4 possibly, if you include the brief statement that he would rise and go ahead of them into Galilee that he'd told them recently. I'm not sure how many, when he'd said these things over the 3 years, but I'll just read out the 3 times when he'd predicted his death and suffering. In chapter 8, verse 31, he says, "He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again." He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. And then in chapter 9, he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." And then again he says in chapter 10, verse 33, "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise." So he'd said these things to them again and again and again in no uncertain terms. And in the Hebrew mind, just to point out, 3 days later seems to be an idiom. It's the same as saying the third day, as far as I can see, because Jesus uses that expression, or Matthew and Luke particularly report him as using that expression in exactly the same passage. So it seems to be the same thing. He said, I'm going to rise on the third day, or I'm going to rise 3 days later. And now it is the third day. And that day has arrived when he's promised that he would rise again. He'd predicted everything. He'd got it all spot on. The flogging, the mocking, the spitting, the rejection, the killing. He told them that all these things would happen. But they didn't believe. They turned up. Nobody was there expecting Jesus to have risen. And yet he'd said, this is exactly what will happen. And they turned up expecting to find a dead body. And yet he'd said, on the third day, I will rise. I'm not sure about you. You know, often you think, what would I have done? And I'm pretty sure I would have been moping with the disciples. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have been going to the tomb expectantly. I don't know what you think you would have done. It's one of those difficult things to put yourself in that situation, because in retrospect, we all like to think that we would have had faith, but I'm pretty sure we wouldn't, because that is the depths of sinfulness in human nature, and that's what we're like. We lack faith, we lack hope, we lack trust in the Lord, unless the Lord, he has to hammer it home by rising from the dead and us seeing it with our own eyes. It's not good enough, just to see the scripture sometimes, is it? The Lord has to prove himself again and again to us, and thankfully he does, and he did it for the disciples. But the thing is, his word is reliable. He always tells the truth. For some reasons, they didn't always listen to him and take it in. But when Jesus says something, he's telling the truth. And it's best to listen carefully and believe it. I mean, that's what we need to do. We need to believe what Jesus says. When he says, I am the resurrection and the life, it's true. When he says, I am the gate, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the bread of life. No one comes to the Father through me. I could go on and on telling you things that Jesus said, but we can believe all these things because when he says something, it's true. He rose from the dead to prove, and God endorsed that everything that he'd ever said was true. So we need to take Jesus' word seriously, as we've noted before in Mark. And the resurrection, really, isn't it? It's the ultimate message to us, unbelieving, hard-hearted people, that God, vindicated Jesus, that everything that he said was true. Verse 4, when they looked up, the stone was rolled away. And I was talking to Mel about the passage, and she said, it's funny, isn't it? The women were going to the tomb, and they were thinking, there's a bit of an obstacle in the way. A large stone, much bigger than they could handle, was in the way. And yet it wasn't an obstacle to God, that stone. They were thinking, who's going to move the stone? But that wasn't an obstacle to God. But also, there's another point there, that their mission to anoint the body wasn't what God was calling them to do, was it? And sometimes it seems God has a solution to our problems, but his solution is much different than the one that we could imagine. They were thinking, we need somebody to roll the stone away so that we can anoint the body. But God rolled the stone away, but that wasn't the point for God. God had raised Jesus from the dead so that they didn't need to anoint the body. And I was thinking those women must have thought on that for years to come. There they were, going, thinking, we've got to move the stone. Who's going to move the stone? And yet, when they got there, God had moved the stone. God had moved it. And he had completely different plans from those women. He didn't just move the stone, but he removed all the things that they were thinking they needed to do. And that's often the case in life, isn't it? That God comes along with a solution which is so much bigger than the one we could have possibly imagined. But then we come to this wonderful bit from verse 5, and it's the most lovely, touching little passage. It's one of the most lovely things in Scripture, isn't it, this? Where they meet the young man. And Mark tells us in his angelic, as the other Gospels make it explicit and say there were angels there. Mark only mentions one angel, and he says he's dressed in white, so we know he's an angel. He's dressed in a white robe. And they're alarmed, not surprisingly. And that word alarmed has the meaning of astonished and somewhat terrified. But the angel speaks tenderly and lovingly to them. And he tells them not to be alarmed. And he knows that the two Marys saw exactly where they laid Jesus' body after the crucifixion, because we see that in the previous passage. And he kindly says, look, he's not there. He's not there anymore where you saw him laid. But he's risen. And then he adds these two other lovely things. Go and tell his disciples he's gone ahead to Galilee. And he says, and tell Peter. Can you imagine what Peter felt when he heard that? You know, Peter, who was in the depths of despair, knows that Jesus is thinking about him, knows that God is thinking that he needs some comfort and reassurance. And he would have been thinking, wow, he's thinking about me. He's mentioned me personally after all that I've done. And the angel doesn't say, you know, Jesus has gone ahead of you and you're going to be in big trouble. That's not the sense of it either, you know, at all. He's going to really, you know, you've really let him down, you lot. He doesn't say that at all. He says, tell them he's gone ahead of you. Tell them and Peter that he's gone ahead of you to meet you there. And you see in the other gospel accounts how tender Jesus was when he met them, when he talked to them. And I'll tell you, it's really, really good news. The things that we believe are really good news. It's good. It's good from beginning to end. When Jesus first appeared on the scene, remember, you know, we see at the beginning of the Gospels, he started calling out, repent and believe the gospel. Change your minds and believe the good news. And when he said it was good news, he really meant that it was good. Mercy and forgiveness, long-suffering, patience, kindness, goodness. You know, Jesus was the living embodiment of all these things from the beginning of his ministry to the end of his ministry. How tenderly and how mercifully and how kindly, how patiently he dealt with his disciples from beginning to the end. And so we come to the end of the passage, and it says, the women were afraid, trembling and bewildered, and they didn't tell anyone else. And I think that because we know from the other Gospels, they went and told the 11. I think that must means they didn't tell anyone else on the way. You know, they didn't go blurting out, he's risen, because they were scared. They'd just met an angel, for one thing, and they were probably a bit nervous about making it known because they wondered what the Jewish leaders would do if they heard. So they didn't tell other people, but they clearly did go back and tell the 11 disciples, as Luke tells us they did, but nobody believed them at first. But I won't go into that because that's not part of what we're talking about this morning, or that's not what Mark gives us. But it's completely understandable that they were fearful, and it's the normal reaction to having an encounter with an angel, for sure. I think in the scriptures, most people when they meet an angel are pretty taken aback, and it says they were also bewildered, and the Greek word for bewildered here, and I checked the commentators on this, is ecstasis or ecstasy, and it captures up a sense of being amazed, in a state of wonder and excitement. And I was thinking, in a few very brief words in this passage, Mark has managed to sort of sum up everything that we could want, hasn't it, about the people who experience the resurrection of Jesus. And in just these few short words, Mark gives the full feeling and force of what it was like for these women. Extreme sorrow and doubt turned to extreme shock and wonder, excitement and fear, all in a few minutes. And I think when I first, because we read these passages over and over again, we sort of miss that, don't we? But if you really read it and think about it and just think and take a word at a time, you think, what an amazing thing that Mark's done there to sum all that up in just 8 verses. That the wonder of it, the shock, the doubt and the fear and the lack of faith, and then to completely turning these women's lives round in a few minutes. So that's the text. And I did say that I want to bookend it with things that Paul had said about the resurrection. But before I do, and I've got a little bit of time, I just wanted to say 3 things, really, that the good reasons to believe that the resurrection is true. You could go away and read a lot more about this. There's loads of books, really good books, that have been written by people on the resurrection and why we can believe it and why it's absolutely reliable and trustworthy. There's loads of people on the internet saying, I can't believe the resurrection, and for various reasons, or everything that they could possibly conjure up about the Bible and Jesus. But there are very good reasons for believing in the resurrection. And I think these testimonies are very reliable. They're not weird, they're not mystical, they're not wacky things made up by the early Christians. And I'll just throw out 3 things this morning to you that I could think of and that are the most sort of talked about ones. And firstly, a well-known one, really, it was the women who were the first witnesses. It's another example of the Lord choosing people of low status and making them significant. But it's also a sign of the truthfulness and the reliability of the gospel accounts. If you were making something like this up, I'm sorry for all the women here, but at the time, if you were making this up 2,000 years ago, you wouldn't have chosen women to report, because it was well known, or it's well known now, and at the time that from reading the literature and the writings of that period, that women's testimonies weren't trusted at all. You can go away and read things. I won't quote them, but there's some pretty strong things that were said by people. They just thought women were hysterical and stuff, rubbish like that. But God didn't. God trusts the word of women. He gives them, he gives them this word. He gives them this message because he thinks that they're as reliable as men. Of course he does. And if you were making this up at the time, you would have chosen Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea to carry this message, people who are mentioned in the gospel accounts around the crucifixion period. Important people. You wouldn't have chosen women because men at the time dismissed their testimony. So Mark and the other gospel writers are just telling us as it is, embarrassing though it would have been. They're just telling it, history as it is. And secondly, the disciples as a whole and the women here were initially skeptical. They were afraid, they were down, they weren't at all full of belief and faith. When the women went to see the body, as we've just noted, they expected to see a dead body. In fact, they probably just thought they were going to have to stand around outside the tomb waiting for somebody to move the stone. That was their that's what they were talking about. And again, the gospel writers tell it as it is. They tell it, just tell it like it really happened. They don't sort of embellish it. They don't give anybody a sort of heroic status in these stories. And the writers were either the disciples themselves, or they were very close and friendly with the people in these narratives. But they don't try and big them up or show them in the best light. In fact, it's really warts and all history that we're getting here, isn't it? It's just real people with all their failures, and that's not what you'd do if you were making these things up. And thirdly, the narratives in the Gospels, as I said before, are different. And that's a problem for some people. They say you can't trust the Gospels. They can't be reliable because Mark's Gospel is different from Matthew's, and Matthew's is different from Luke's and John's. How can you trust accounts which differ in so many ways? But that's exactly what you'd expect if you were getting a number of people telling their stories at different times, recollections of things that happened, because people observe different things, and they think about different things. They have different impressions of the same event. And it's clear they didn't copy each other. There was no collusion amongst the writers to make sure that they'd all agreed beforehand, to make it all smooth. And when police interview people about a crime, and all those people say exactly the same thing, then the police know that something's wrong. They've colluded beforehand. Stories of true events, though, will always vary when told by people who haven't got together beforehand. There'll always be differences, and that's why the Gospels have the ring of truth and credibility. So those are just my thoughts, but there's loads more that you can read about those matters in big books that have been written about these things by, really scholarly Christians. And so finally, just coming back, as I said, to a couple of things that Paul said. In Romans 10, he says, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And note that he said God raised Jesus from the dead. God raised him from the dead because this showed that he was in fact the Messiah, that he was the anointed one of God. And if we believe that about Jesus, we believe everything about Jesus. If we believe that God raised him from the dead, then everything else, that he was the Son of God, that he was the Messiah, that he was sent from God, we believe all those things as well. All those things are bound up in believing that God raised him from the dead, because God is vindicating Jesus his whole life by raising him from the dead. God would never raise a false teacher from the dead, would he? So this is the most important biblical application, really. It's what we have to believe in our hearts. We have to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, that God raised him from the dead, rather. And if we do, we will confess with our mouths that Jesus Christ is Lord. And that's what we must believe to be saved. But I think we can also take something else devotional, encouraging from this passage, apart from that sort of big picture thing that I've just said. And I'll just end with this thought. At this moment, all the disciples, without exception, were discouraged. They would have been desolate. And one of their close friends, Judas, had suddenly betrayed the Lord. And this would have sent them into shock. It would have made them real. It must have been just a wretched experience for them all round at this time. And the women must have been feeling miserable beyond misery, mustn't they, when they went to the tomb? Just so low. They'd given up believing. All hope inside them had died at that moment, at that time. How could even Jesus raise himself from the dead? But they'd forgotten the power of God. They'd forgotten that he is the God of hope, as Paul calls him in Romans. He's the God of hope. And in another place, Paul tells the church at Corinth, he says, we were under a burden far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, we felt we were under the sentence of death, in order that we would not trust ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. And Paul uses this thought himself, that God raises the dead, to encourage himself, so we can encourage ourselves with that thought too. We can take away that encouragement that he is a God of hope. He is a God who raises the dead. When we're down and out, when we're in a place of desperation, when all hope seems to have gone, the truth is we've been brought to that place like the two Marys and Salome. We've been brought to that place so that we might not rely on ourselves, so that we might not trust in ourselves, but we might trust in the God of hope and the God who raises the dead. So that's the hope that we have for 2025. We might have hope in the God of hope and the God who raises the dead.